Hello, I'm Andrea, and this is the story of migration in my family. To begin the story, we'll go all the way back to when my parents met in 1990. Some background information on the kind of people that my parents were. My dad was a pretty nerdy guy who grew up in Texas, playing video games, reading science fiction novels, and listening to AC/DC. He was in the Marines at the time, but he later left and joined the Army before I was born. My mom was a lovely Puerto Rican lady studying at a college in San Juan, Puerto Rico. She grew up on the beach with parents who were hippies and surfers, so she lived a pretty free-spirited lifestyle, and still does. Now, in 1990, my dad was on duty in Puerto Rico as a Marine. One night, he and some of his Marine buddies decided to go to an Irish pub in Isla Verde, which just so happens to be the same pub that my mom decided to go to with some of her friends. Long story short, they met, they dated, my dad proposed, and my mom said no. My dad was so disappointed he punched in a car window, and eventually my mom said yes. Now is the part of the story where migration becomes the main plot, and things are a little more complicated. It all started in Puerto Rico, where my mom and dad met, got married, and had their first kid, my sister Gabriela. Then they moved to Germany for the first time. That's where my brother Jonathan was born. Then after my mom becomes pregnant with me, they moved back to Puerto Rico, which is where I was born. After that, we moved to Watertown, New York. Then we moved to Germany again for 3 years. Then to Fort Benning, Georgia for 3 years. Then back to Germany again for 5 years. And then we moved to California for just 1 year, when finally my dad decides to retire and buy a house in Florida, where we've lived now for about 4 or 5 years. All this moving around is what defined the lives of my siblings and I. Although I did have to go to 3 different elementary schools and 3 different high schools, I would never give up all of that experience I gained from constantly moving and wandering. My parents had hometowns. They graduated high school with the people that they were in kindergarten with, as most people do. And because of the standards and the policies of the U.S. Army that requires us to move every 2 to 3 years, I got to walk inside the Notre Dame. I got to light a candle in a tiny church in the Swiss Alps, and I got to wander through the Colosseum all before I'd even reached my teens. I probably wouldn't have that, and I might not be here studying in university in Colorado if things had worked out any differently. If my mother had chosen to raise us in Puerto Rico and given us more Puerto Rican sounding names rather than names like Andrea, Jonathan, and Gabriela. If we'd grown up speaking Spanish all our lives rather than forgetting most of the language while we were young and speaking fluent English. Instead, we attended English-speaking schools on American Army bases. No one mispronounced our names, and no one made fun of our accents, as they did to my mother. And that was the story of my family's migration. Thanks for listening.